For 20 years, one man stood at the center of American television every Monday night, and nobody thought to prepare for the day he wouldn't be there anymore. When the ending finally came, it arrived so quietly that most of the people who made the show didn't even know it was happening. This is the story of how the longest-running television drama in American history said goodbye without ever really saying goodbye at all, and why the final hour of Gunsmoke still leaves longtime fans a little unsettled decades later. James Arness didn't set out to become the face of the American West. He was born James King Arness on May 26, 1923, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the son of a father with Norwegian roots and a mother who would go on to work as a newspaper columnist. His younger brother was Peter Arness, who would later change his own name and become known to audiences as actor Peter Graves. The Arness boys grew up in a fairly ordinary Minneapolis household, and nothing about James's childhood pointed toward Hollywood. He drifted through school without much distinction, worked odd jobs, and eventually enrolled at Beloit College in Wisconsin, where he sang in the choir and joined a fraternity. What he actually wanted was to fly for the Navy. That dream ended almost as soon as it started. He stood 6 feet 7 inches tall, well past the height ceiling the Navy set for its aviators, and there was no getting around it. World War II didn't ask what he wanted. Arness was drafted into the Army in March 1943 and trained before shipping overseas with the 3rd Infantry Division. On January 22, 1944, he came ashore during the Allied landing at Anzio, Italy, one of the bloodiest and most drawn-out operations of the Italian campaign. Because he was so tall, he was chosen to be among the first off the landing craft, wading into the surf ahead of the others to measure how deep the water actually was. Not long after the landing, German machine gun fire tore into his leg and foot. The wound was serious enough to end his time in combat and begin a long, difficult recovery that stretched across more than a year and multiple surgeries, first overseas and then at the 91st General Hospital in Clinton, Iowa. His younger brother visited him during that stretch and, according to accounts Arness gave later in life, encouraged him not to give up on the future, pointing out that there might be work waiting for him in radio once he was back on his feet. In January 1945, after months of treatment, Arness was honorably discharged. He carried the physical cost of that day at Anzio for the rest of his life. Decades later, while riding horses on the set of Gunsmoke, the old injury would still flare up, a private reminder hidden underneath the calm authority he projected on screen. The path from a hospital bed in Iowa to Dodge City wasn't direct. Arness first tried radio, working as an announcer back home in Minnesota, and it was there that he built the deep, steady voice that would later suit a frontier lawman so well. But radio wasn't enough to hold him, and he eventually made his way to Los Angeles to try acting. Progress was slow. He took small parts, often cast because of his imposing size rather than any specific talent audiences had come to expect from him, and he spent several years playing henchmen, aliens, and background heavies before anything resembling a real career took shape. His breakthrough came through an unlikely connection. An agent who represented John Wayne noticed Arness and introduced the two men. Wayne, drawn to Arness's presence and size, took him under a personal contract and gave him supporting roles in a string of films, including Island in the Sky, Hondo, and The Sea Chase. The relationship between the two actors grew into something closer to mentorship, and it would end up shaping the entire second half of Arness's career. By the mid-1950s, CBS was preparing to bring Gunsmoke to television after its run as a successful radio drama, and the network needed someone who could physically embody Marshal Matt Dillon, a character built on quiet restraint rather than gunslinging bravado. Arness was reportedly reluctant to commit to a television series at all, worried about being tied down to a single role for years on end. It was Wayne who pushed him to take the part, going so far as to personally introduce Arness to viewers in a filmed prologue that aired before the very first episode in 1955. That endorsement mattered. Arness altered his appearance for the role, darkening his naturally lighter hair, and trained with gun-handling expert Arvo Ohala to look convincing with a revolver. Whatever hesitation he had walked in with, he committed to it completely once the cameras started rolling. The first stretch of the show wasn't easy for him. Arness had experience in film, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer physical demands of a weekly television drama, where an actor might face 8 pages of dialogue on an interior set in the morning and another 6 pages on location by afternoon, week after week, with no real break in the schedule. Around him were performers who already understood how to work at that pace, Milburn Stone, Amanda Blake, and Dennis Weaver had all built up their craft, and next to their polish, Arness has said he felt like he was still catching up. The pressure built quietly through that first season, enough that one of the show's sponsors arranged for him to start working with an acting coach. It helped. Within roughly 6 months, by most accounts, Arness had settled into the role in a way that finally felt natural rather than forced, and the character that would go on to define an era of American television began to take real shape. Not everyone on set was won over immediately, though. Milburn Stone, who played the cantankerous but warm-hearted Doc Adams, was famously skeptical of the newcomer in those early days, and the friction between the two men became something of a running story on set. Stone, a stickler for professionalism and precision in performance, reportedly grew frustrated with what he saw as a lack of focus from Arness during rehearsals, small habits like fidgeting or being distracted that read, to Stone, as a lack of seriousness about the work. That frustration eventually came to a head, and Stone confronted Arness directly and without much restraint. What could have become a lasting rift instead marked a turning point. Rather than getting defensive, Arness reportedly accepted the criticism and used it, and over the following months the working relationship between the two men shifted from tension into genuine respect. By the time the series had been running for a few years, Stone had become one of Arness's strongest defenders on set, and the wider cast had developed the kind of loyalty to one another that outsiders, visiting producers, network executives, guest directors, could feel the moment they stepped onto the soundstage. Gunsmoke went on to run for 20 seasons, from 1955 to 1975, becoming the longest-running primetime drama in American television history up to that point, a record it would hold for decades. Arness appeared in nearly every episode across 2 decades, an extraordinary run of continuity for any actor in any role. The show's ensemble grew and changed over the years. Dennis Weaver's Chester eventually gave way to Ken Curtis's Festus Hagen, and later Buck Taylor joined as Newly O'Brien. But Matt Dillon remained the fixed point around which everything else revolved. Arness, for his part, consistently downplayed his own centrality in interviews, crediting the show's longevity to the people around him rather than to his own performance. He spoke often and warmly about producer John Mantley, who guided the series for much of its run and whom Arness credited with protecting the integrity of the scripts and the characters even as television around them kept changing. And television was changing faster than Gunsmoke itself ever did. Through the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, American culture was being reshaped by the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and deep public divisions over the war in Vietnam, and network programmers increasingly wanted shows that reflected those tensions rather than shows that offered an escape from them. This shift became known, somewhat bluntly, as the Rural Purge, a wave of cancellations that swept away a whole category of folksy, small-town programming almost at once. Green Acres, Petticoat Junction, Mayberry RFD, and the Beverly Hillbillies were all cut loose within a few seasons of each other, and even Bonanza, another long-running Western giant, wasn't far behind. In their place came sharper, more socially engaged shows like All in the Family and M*A*S*H, series willing to tackle subjects Gunsmoke had generally kept at arm's length. Despite still drawing solid ratings, Gunsmoke increasingly looked, to network executives, like a relic of an earlier television era. CBS canceled the show in 1975, and by most accounts the decision caught the cast and crew almost entirely off guard. There had been no sense inside the production that the 20th season would be the last one. The cast expected at least another year, possibly several more, given where the ratings still stood. Because of that, nobody built the final episode of the season to function as a series finale. Nobody wrote a farewell arc for Matt Dillon. Nobody planned a send-off for the characters who had carried the show for 2 decades. The episode that happened to air last, The Sharecroppers, was filmed and broadcast as an ordinary weekly episode, with no one involved aware it would end up closing the book on the entire series. The Sharecroppers aired on CBS on March 31, 1975, directed by Leonard Katzman. Its plot has almost nothing to do with Matt Dillon at all. The story centers on Festus Hagen, Ken Curtis's deputy character, who accidentally shoots a young man named Abel Pugh in the leg during a dispute over a mule. Racked with guilt, Festus ends up spending the episode helping the Pugh family work their land as a kind of penance, getting tangled up in the family's various squabbles over debt, marriage, and a demanding landlord along the way. It plays, by design, as a light, comic hour, closer to a standalone character piece for Festus than anything resembling a culmination of 20 years of storytelling. Matt Dillon is present in the episode, but is far from its focus, and other long-tenured characters barely register at all. There's no reflective final scene, no acknowledgement on screen that this was the last time these people would share the frame. That absence is exactly what makes the episode difficult to sit through once you know what it actually was. Television historian Hal Erickson later described it as a low-key, almost throwaway hour that gave no hint whatsoever that a two-decade era of American broadcasting was about to end. Viewers who revisited the episode afterward, once its status as a finale became known, often pointed to the same disconnect. A show that had spent 20 years building an ensemble audiences trusted like family suddenly wrapped up with barely a nod to most of that ensemble. Some critics were more forgiving, framing the episode as an appropriately understated goodbye, a small, everyday story of the kind Gunsmoke had always told, rather than a grand send-off it never claimed to be. But even that generous reading doesn't fully erase the strangeness of watching a show end without anyone involved realizing, in the moment, that it was ending. The behind-the-scenes reality makes the episode even harder to shake off. Even producer John Mantley reportedly wasn't given advance warning that this would be the series' final broadcast. The cancellation news arrived from the network after the season's episodes were already filmed, leaving no room to build any kind of proper conclusion. Milburn Stone, who appears in The Sharecroppers as Doc Adams, was making what turned out to be his last appearance in the role, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. He would go on to retire from the part a few years later before passing away in 1980. For a cast that had spent 2 decades building the kind of closeness where a disagreement inside the family stayed inside the family, but any outside interference drew everyone together in solidarity, the ending offered none of the closure that kind of bond might have earned. Arness himself later confirmed that the cancellation blindsided everyone connected to the show, cast and crew alike. There simply wasn't a moment, on set or off, where anyone treated the filming of that Festus-centered episode as historically significant. It was simply the next script on the schedule. Only in hindsight, once CBS had made its decision and the season quietly closed out, did the Sharecroppers take on the weight of being the last time Matt Dillon walked the streets of Dodge City as a weekly television character. Arness didn't disappear from westerns after Gunsmoke ended, even if the character that made him famous no longer had a regular home on network television. He went on to star in the miniseries How the West Was Won, which found an especially devoted audience in Europe, where Arness reportedly achieved something close to cult status. Between 1987 and 1994, he returned to the role of Matt Dillon 5 separate times in a series of made-for-television Gunsmoke films, giving the character something the original series finale never managed: a set of genuine, deliberate goodbyes, spread out across nearly a decade, that let both the actor and the audience revisit Dodge City on their own terms. In 2001, Arness published an autobiography, with a foreword written by his old castmate Ken Curtis's fellow Gunsmoke veteran Buck Taylor, giving fans a first-hand account of the 2 decades he spent inside the role, including details about the Anzio wound that shaped so much of his life before Hollywood ever entered the picture. James Arness died on June 3, 2011, at the age of 88, having spent more time as Marshal Matt Dillon than most actors spend on their entire careers combined. What lingers about The Sharecroppers, even now, isn't that it's a bad episode of television. By most accounts, it's a perfectly serviceable, mildly amusing hour built around Ken Curtis at the height of his comic timing. What lingers is the mismatch between what the moment actually was and how little the show itself seemed to know it. 20 years of Dodge City, of a marshal who held a fictional town together through